I have been often asked, what is a PhD? I think other than the very basic understanding of what a PhD is, I thought I'd share with you today something that has come out of experiencing a PhD. I'd like to really share it in two parts. One, in terms of the hard deliverables that you get out of a PhD, but I think more importantly, the fine elements of the experience that you get through the 4, 5, 6 years of a PhD that could then help you very much in your career as a scientist. So first, let's get to the hard facts of what a PhD is. To me, a PhD is really a formal training to conduct structured research. When I say structured research, it is about really looking at a problem and putting it through some kind of an analysis to figure out what would then be the technical approaches, depending on, of course, the field of research that you've done your PhD in, and then kind of in a layered manner begin to answer the questions one after the other. So, for example, it's like peeling an onion. So the elementary question that you ask may not be the final question that you will ultimately ask in your PhD. You start off with a very generic question and slowly begin through the tools and techniques that you learn in your PhD to begin to answer layers of questions one after the other, starting from the more generic ones to the more specific ones. And I think in that process is where you come across in a particular field or area a specific question that has not been answered before, which then leads to original research, both in terms of methodology and conclusions, that helps you then find the final solution, which is then original research that then becomes a part of what is called a PhD thesis. So to me, a PhD is really only a formal training to conduct research in a very structured manner. I think two elements of the structure of research really stand out. One is a hypothesis-led inquiry. So very often you could ask a very general question in mundane ways and you could get an answer. The answer is not something that has come out of a deep thought. It's something that you've experienced, something like, do you like coffee? You're really going to just come out of, as a first thought, an answer to your experiences of having coffee in the past. But when you start into hypothesis-led inquiry, you begin to ask a question and then you form what is a likely answer to that question. And then you begin to actually conduct either experiments or modeling or whatever it is for that field of research to kind of ensure whether the answer which you hypothesized is approved or rejected. And through that layers of building a hypothesis and then either confirming it or negating it, you begin to unravel the answer to the question. I think the other big aspect in terms of the hard skills that you learn in a PhD is actually asking the right question. Very often I have heard said from my seniors and mentors that finding the question is probably the more difficult part in a process of getting through a PhD program. So I think it's really about being very aware of what's the field of research that you are in, what are the questions that have been asked previously, how were they answered, and with respect to the specific problem that you're encountering, being able to ask the right question to then begin to trigger thoughts and creativity that would then kind of help you answer that question. So that's all about what a real PhD means for me. And in general, this is something that I've heard spoken of from colleagues who've been pursuing research and so on. Then coming to the softer aspects of the experience of doing a PhD. So very often you do a PhD with a supervisor in a laboratory if you're doing experimental research, but in a research group if you are probably doing a theoretical research. But either way, you are doing it with a supervisor who has a few number of students who will be at different stages of their PhD, because typically you get to join PhD in a particular year, and typically a faculty would not get 1 or 2 or 3 students joining that year, but you would be doing it every year. So between the 5 or 6 years that a PhD takes, you would have a group of 15, 20 colleagues in your lab, doing PhD at different stages. So I think the first aspect that you begin to appreciate during this PhD program is that while you all are working probably in an area of expertise that your supervisor has defined, you begin to realize how broad that area is and how many people it takes to begin to really to kind of go back to the analogy of peeling that onion. There's just so many onions to be peeled, and they're all very different in shape and size, right? So that's the first sense of what science is. And even in the limited area of research that you are, there still so many unanswered problems to be attacked and answered during your PhD. So that's, I think, itself an awakening, in kind of your spirit of inquiry. The second one is a sense of collaboration. So you realize that when you join the laboratory, you are very new. You've just done what is probably a master's or a BTech course, where they really don't teach you about inquiry. You have a very structured study regime in those courses. And this is where you begin to realize that while your supervisor would give you some time, it's really your colleagues in the lab or your lab mates with whom you learn to collaborate. You begin to help them with something that they would be willing to rely on, and you in return get to learn the finer aspects of either learning how to operate an instrument which they have operated in the past, or just begin to chit chat around exchanges of science. And that is really the first step to collaboration. I think the second aspect, or the third aspect really, is about technically being able to articulate what you are doing in science. And this comes through because, when you are in that atmosphere of doing a PhD, very often the question that's asked to you, even when you're a young PhD student, is, what are you working on? And quite often you might be working on something very complex, but you then begin to answer that question in different ways depending on who is asking. If it's a PhD student who is just joined in and younger to you, you kind of break it down into a very different way. To someone who is a very senior faculty who really understands the area already, you then dive into the technicalities of what you are looking at in terms of the unanswered problem that you are looking at. So that really hones in areas of technical articulation while you're doing your PhD. And I think finally, and this is maybe not just in your PhD, even well past your PhD, I think what you do as a scientist and a professional in the area of science is to be able to create and defend a position. And that's something that takes probably more than a PhD and probably a few more years of experience, where in a given area, you begin to own that area to say, this is what that science or that area stands for. And that's a position, that standing position is what you then begin to either create and in future defend. So for example, in certain problems of science, you realize that it is an unanswered question. So there might be two different schools of thought on, thinking of, well, this is the way this nature manifests itself in this problem. And there might be a completely different approach to doing this. And very often, these are conflicting. And remember, these are scientific conflicts. These are not conflicts between people carrying out. And therefore, you have the right to own a position based on your thinking, your research. You begin to think, well, I think this because A, B, C, D, right? So that's the creation of a position. I think for me, the most important thing about having a PhD and having attained certain amount of experience of research is really about creating and defending a scientific position. This can be in papers, this can be in technical articles, or this can be, when you are up on the stage at a conference, kind of doing that. So that to me is really the maturity of starting with a training in terms of picking up the scientific tools to answer a question, and then about hypothesis-led inquiry and doing a particular way of, I would say, scientific forensics. And the final is really the finer aspects like collaboration, technical articulation, appreciating each other's areas of research, and finally being able to create and defend its position. So I hope that kind of answers the oft-repeated question of what is a PhD. I must say that I was inspired to answer this question by folks who have asked me on my LinkedIn, through messaging. So quite a few young scientists who have asked me this question, including some very young, friends who reached out to me. But more importantly, I stumbled upon this question that was answered in I think a YouTube video by someone called a curious biotechnologist. But I think the answers were mostly from academics and mostly from people working in bioscience. So it just got me thinking that what is a PhD is well beyond just a particular field of biotechnology. I thought I'd break it down from a perspective of myself, where it's, of course, in the domain of physical sciences, where I have my PhD. But more importantly, I have now an experience of working in academia and in industrial research over the years. So this would probably be my first video answering a question like this. I do hope to add a few more questions which are fundamental to research and the research position. So thank you for asking me that question, and it's really a pleasure to be able to answer it and share it with all of you. Thank you so much.